Let's face it, in our busy lives, we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. In fact, according to the CDC, only 1 in 10 Americans are eating the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables each day, missing out on essential vitamins, minerals, fibers, and antioxidants. And that's where Balance in Nature comes in. Balance in Nature sources only the best produce, free from pesticides, heavy metals, and harmful bacteria. And Balance in Nature is the best fruit and vegetable product on the market. They use only fresh, whole fruits and vegetables inside each capsule. They don't use any GMOs, fillers, binding agents, or preservatives of any kind. You're getting real food, real science, real nutrition. I would never endorse a product that I don't use myself, and since using Balance in Nature, I feel more alert, I have more energy, my focus is sharper, and I feel great. Live life to the fullest and choose Balance in Nature. And guess what? P.A.S. Report listeners can get 35% off the first preferred order. Start getting the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables you need by using code PAS at balanceofnature.com.
Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. As your host, Nick Giordano, and we are now less than 4 weeks away from the midterm elections. It's interesting to watch the polling. It seems that Americans are beginning to make up their minds, and that's not good news for Democrats. At a time where we're seeing continued inflation, gas prices are now inching up again. Of course, they'd rather talk about anything else but the real issues that are negatively impacting American households, that are destroying the economic livelihoods of American families. And many on the left continue to push and inject racism and bigotry into every single argument that exists. Unfortunately for them, it seems they have a very big problem of race and racism of their own when it comes to their own party. Just last week, you had the Los Angeles City Council president, Nuri Martinez. She was caught on tape making racist remarks with 2 other council people. Disgustingly, she compared a council member's son to a monkey, cursed out another council member, accusing them of being for the blacks, and there was much more. This audio was captured almost a year ago, and these were private conversations reflecting who she really is. That's the problem with the public virtue signalers that exist out there. They constantly preach about how moral and noble they are in front of their cameras. They accuse their political opponents of being racist when no one's watching. They reveal themselves for the frauds they really are. And I have a great guest today to discuss this issue and how the racialization of every issue is damaging our society. More importantly, how the whole debate about race doesn't actually match up to the reality. I'm bringing in Wilfred Riley. Wilfred is the author of Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, and Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. He is someone that really gets to the nitty-gritty of the data, and his findings are eye-opening. Before I bring in Wilfred, be sure to follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. If you find the content of the podcast informative, share it with others, and visit the PAS Report website to check out the show notes. With that out of the way, I want to bring in Wilfred Riley, author of the books Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, and Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. These are phenomenal books I encourage you to read. They are extraordinarily informative, they're funny, they're witty. And Wilfred, glad to have you back on the program. How are you today?
Doing well. Glad to be on.
So you're someone that dives deep into the data, particularly when it comes to things like racism and academia and whatnot. When it comes to racism, what do you find when you dig deep into the data? Is it a problem in the United States? How big of a problem it is, or is it being exploited?
Well, I think your second question there is really key, because when you look at how countries, how societies, and political science, we'd say nation states are performing, you have to compare them to other real places that exist. You can't use heaven or utopia as the comparator. So, I mean, in reality, the United States is one of the least racist countries in the world. And that's one of the things I open my intro to political science class with every couple of years. We pull up the data from, for example, the World Values Survey and just look at it. And every couple of years, I mean, a well-trained team asks people literally around the planet, how comfortable would you be with neighbors, close friends, a spouse of a different race or religion? And on that question, I mean, the USA is annually one of a couple places, along with Britain, along with Uruguay and Latin America, where the huge majority of people are not bigots at all. I mean, right now, the rate of people that are comfortable with interracial marriage, without getting too wonky, I mean, it's about 94% for whites. It's about 90% for blacks, if I recall correctly. It's just extremely high. So there obviously are racists in the United States, but I mean, when you look at the rest of the world, I mean, India, Israel, very large civilized countries, France, the Arab world, we're by no means near the top of that list.
No,
And yeah, and minority led countries, South Africa, Nigeria, Japan. I mean, the great Asian and Black states, they're by no means any less racist than the significant white nations. So I think we're doing pretty well.
I think so too. And what's the student reaction when you tell them that and actually show them the data to back it up?
One of the people at Kentucky State, Kentucky State is interesting in racial terms because it's a historically Black college and it's located in Appalachia. We're in central Kentucky. So you have a mix of working class Black and white kids that get along quite well, that date each other and so on in personal life, but that feel like that's kind of atypical, that have really often consumed that narrative of constant racial conflict in society. So when they get into one of my classes that's something like quantitative methods or intro, that's just math, where we're going through this stuff, a common reaction isn't hostility, it's not disbelief, but it's sort of, why haven't I heard this before? Why haven't I heard this on MSNBC or CNN or even Fox? Why does everyone seem so afraid if this is the reality? And I think that's a good question that a lot of Americans ought to ask. So, I mean, when you say, is racism exploited? I think just the numbers can kind of tell you that, what people believe versus reality. So my favorite figure like this is if you ask either Blacks or white liberals, okay, I mean, we just saw George Floyd, Jacob Blake. How many unarmed Black men do you believe are killed in a typical year, just unarmed, just Black, by white police officers? The average answer is close to 10,000. I mean, so it's, like 34% of people say about 1,000, 18%, I believe, say about 10,000, 8% say more than that. Now, keep in mind, there are only 20,000 murders in a year, and only about half of those involve Blacks. We're overrepresented, but not to the extent that people are assuming with these numbers. So, I mean, that's an insane figure. And when you show them the actual number, which is like 20, they're sort of shocked. And the question is, well, why are we being shown this constantly? Does someone have an agenda here? You know, what's the actual purpose of BLM? And even from left-leaning college students who are very smart guys, you get these questions. And I think the answer is obviously, yeah, someone has an agenda here. That's how you get from the 20 guys to the 10,000 guys.
It is amazing. It's like, I remember during COVID, 70% of Democrats believed if you got COVID, you're going to the hospital. It's just so disproportionate and crazy. But, in academia, I mean, I remember when I was sitting on the faculty senate, God help me, thank God I don't have to do that anymore. And they were talking about passing a resolution after Trump won the election in 2016 about racism and the college doesn't tolerate racism or anything. And I turned around and I'm like, have we seen an uptick in incidents in the classroom, on the campuses? I mean, we got 3 campuses. It's huge. No. So then why are we talking about this? I mean, I teach college students for the last almost 2 decades, and I never had an incident in class between Black students, white students, Hispanic students. Everyone coexists pretty well together. And I think your book does lay it out well, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Really Talk About, where it is a topic that nobody really wants to talk about in an honest way. And everything in our society is becoming racialized, every aspect of our society. So how do we begin to have the conversation if you have one side that will demonize and call you racist, try and silence you, destroy your career? How do we have that conversation if that's the threat that looms over us?
Well, I think that first, I mean, those of us on kind of the business center right, which is where I think we fall, but those of us on the right wing, I mean, someone are going to have to break this infrastructure that's pushing this. I mean, the problem with this is the current racial ideology that's being promoted isn't going to do anything positive. I mean, as a political scientist, and I think we've both trained in this field. I mean, you can look at South Africa, Sri Lanka, Lebanon. I mean, there are plenty of countries that have gone this route of Malaysia. Let's emphasize the glorious differences within our society, the beautiful, pre-boomy Malaysians and the entrepreneurial Chinese, and let's learn all our traditional languages. And it always ends up with people hating each other. I mean, you can't give people like their own language and flag and so on again when they've gotten used to just looking up at the Malaysian dragon and smiling. It doesn't make any sense. So you always, at least in the larger countries like that, when they were able to cut it off short of war. But I mean, in Sri Lanka, for example, you saw large scale violence that went on for decades. I mean, I believe the Tamil Tigers were blowing up buses and so on. Yep. Because if you tell people these narratives, if you give people these storylines like whites are holding down Blacks, or what have blacks ever invented? I mean, these pitches from one group to the other, it's very easy for an exchange of insults to turn into a fight and for that to grow. So, I mean, when you actually look at serious quants looking at this stuff, I mean, one of my favorite researchers out right now is Roland Fryer. And he seems to, as we both do, but I mean, he has a platform at Harvard, he seems to kind of enjoy poking the bear. So, I mean, he'll do things like look at whether diversity training produces any positive results. And I think every one of us that's been in a business leadership role knows it doesn't. It irritates white guys. It bores minorities. It's just you have to answer questions about the ethnic groups fighting. It's not any good. But what he found is that no, it literally against a whole series of metrics, like does the team work better together? It doesn't do anything. And if you keep doing it, it has negative results because people get angry with each other. So this ideology that is currently very prevalent, there's no evidence across a whole bunch of sectors: diversity training, stereotype threat, implicit bias. We could get into the transgender stuff. Does this make people's life better if you go through these devastating surgeries? They remove your breasts. I mean, is there any evidence for these things that are being advocated? The answer is kind of no. So, I mean, I think that the fight right now is kind of getting what most people glibly call wokeness out of institutions before it can do damage.
Do you think it's already done damage?
Well, of course. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much damage it's done as of right now, other than to something like perceptions of race relations. But I don't think it can do any good because it's based on incorrect starting assumption. To me, and openly for anyone that hasn't guessed this from what I've said so far for 10 minutes. But I mean, I'm on the political right. I did pretty well in business. I hate communism. So to me, all this stuff is just downstream from Marxism. Like almost every popular left liberal theory is just a lower IQ version of Marxism, in my opinion. So what Marx...
The scary part is they don't even know what Marxism is. They'll spout Marxist philosophies, but they don't even know what Marxism is if you ask them.
Yeah, well, they're not familiar with their own OG. It's a pity. It's like me not knowing who Tom Sowell is. But it really, though, what Marx did that is unique. I mean, as an economist, he wasn't much. What he did that was unique was really outline kind of a friend of mine once called it the unpopular high school kid view of society. And I think that's a funny descriptor. And there's even some truth to the unpopular high school kid view of society. But Marx took the old, what would it be, Rousseauian view that society is kind of a scam. And he streamlined it and made it into a theory. So the basic Marxist idea is that all of society is set up by the rich to oppress the poor. You have the bourgeoisie who control the means of production, and you have the proletariat who are simply struggling serf-level workers. And again, this is clearly wrong. Where do you classify a lawyer? I mean, there are hundreds of questions that have been asked by intelligent conservative thinkers. But the idea itself is very tempting. And from there, you go on to every element of society has been designed by the bourgeois, the law, for example, to control the proles. So things that seem facially neutral, like the rules governing property ownership, are in fact designed to help those who have property keep and consolidate their property and to keep poor men from getting property. All of society is this cruel, corrupt, hollow structure that's designed to abuse poor men and women. So essentially, critical race theory is just that, like word for word sometimes. I don't think anyone's plagiarizing, but if you read through Harris, it's the same concepts, Delgado, Stefanczyk. I mean, the original stuff from them, but it's the exact same idea. It's just you take class and you sub in race.
Yeah.
I mean, that's literally it. Like The Value of Whiteness is a famous paper by Cheryl Harris. And again, they're not cribbing Marx, but it's exactly the same idea. It's like, well, being white gives you access to these tools of power that allow you to control social institutions. Radical feminism is the same thing, but the rich man has been replaced not by the white man, but by the man. So all of society is set up to benefit males. And it can almost get funny. Like, I mean, Judith Butler would argue that marriage is just a way for men to get as much sex as possible. And I mean, I think a lot of married men would look at that.
I'm not going to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I'm in a long-term relationship. It's not bad, But I mean, but whether or not this is true, again, because I'm not a communist, I think that is the idea that all of society is set up to benefit men. And you go from there through every one of these quirky theories, fat studies, queer theory. Queer theory is almost a direct retemplate of the Marxist model. It's all of society is set up by straight, quote unquote, normal people who define the idea of normalcy, who call what we do illegal or creepy. But anyway, the problem with all these ideas is that most of them are simply wrong. Like the claim of CRT is that all of society is set up to oppress minorities. And all gaps in performance between minorities and whites are due to this kind of racism. This is Ibram Kendi. I mean, page 2 of his book. And the way to fix these gaps is what he calls equity, which just means proportional representation without regard to performance. And the problem with that is, again, just it's facially inaccurate. Like half of the minority groups in the country, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Black immigrants, Jews, Arabs, so on, outperform whites. Many of the lowest performing groups, Irishmen until recently, no offense to that fine population, but Appalachians, Cajuns are white. So there's no way to explain this using the theory. Nonetheless, though, the incorrectness has not stopped kind of the popularity of these simple models. And yeah, I would say that adopting them, this is the point. Yes, adopting them is going to do harm because it can't do good. Like right now in 2022 Baltimore, the thing holding back the Black community might be terrible schools, lack of fathers, high crime, even sort of some things that the left points out, like the lack of quality housing. There's a decent YIMBY movement, like people shouldn't be forced to live in the projects if they make enough not to. You know, one of the things that helps with homelessness, in addition to, dealing with drug problems, is more housing. But all those things do affect you if you're a poor Black guy, or for that matter, Italian American guy in Baltimore. But something that doesn't is white control of Baltimore. I mean, it's absurd to say that white supremacist Republican control of the city is the problem. So focusing on that, like we need to reduce white supremacy in the Baltimore city government via mandatory weekly diversity trainings. All you're doing there is wasting tens of millions of dollars. So I guess that's kind of rambling, but that's my conclusion. I don't think you're going to get anything out of this.
Yeah, it's like Jesse Smollett. You're in Trump country in the middle of Chicago. No, that's not Trump country. But evidence doesn't matter anymore because now it's all about emotion. So when you try and speak logically, it's one of the reasons we can't have a conversation is you can't point out obvious truths. So we know that most crimes are committed between the ages of 16 to 25. We also know that 98% of crimes committed, might have gone down a little bit, are committed by males. We know that the median age of white people is about 50-something years old, and the median age of Black people is about 25, 26 years old. But we can't talk about crime in inner cities because then it's racism by pointing it out. Instead, we got to sit here, pretend, and lie, and that goes against academia, but even academia is in on this, that they're the ones that also do push a lot of this stuff. It's now pushed down to the K through 12 system. And I'm getting in college students, especially after COVID, they can't write. Mm-hmm. They never read. They can't come up with complex arguments, cohesive, complex arguments, and then back those arguments up with data, even though we're supposed to follow the data, follow the science too. What's going on in a K through 12 system? And are you seeing the same thing at your college where students coming in lacking any ability to think critically and they're overly simplistic where they're, we just had Columbus Day. We're going to apply 2022 standards to people that existed hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, I think that the underlying question there is how many systems you're willing to destroy to be politically correct. And it's interesting because you mostly see this question only on the edge right, but it's obviously a real valid question. Like logic has to be your guide here. So, I mean, like when you talk about crime, for example, I'll just start with kind of the toughest one. Like, yeah, there's a much higher crime rate in Black communities. A big reason for that is age. Now, some of the ages you gave, I think there are modes instead of medians, so that doesn't explain it all. Like fatherlessness also plays a big role, so on. But just and there's a lot of other things, like Black people live more in the South, which has traditionally had a higher crime rate, a more working class community. If you make the adjustments, most of the Black-white gap does go away. I mean, nobody thinks that Appalachia is a crime-free, drug-free region, so on. I mean, but it's still
it's amazing. You would think poor white people don't exist in this country if you listen to half these folks.
Poor white people are the most ignored group in the country, for good and ill, like to a crazy extent. Like when I'm talking about either generational suffering or crime, although here a lot of it's nonviolent. I mean, in the sense of burglaries, selling opiates, things that do a significant amount of harm, but don't necessarily involve a pistol. But when I'm talking about this with like friends of mine back from the East Coast and Midwestern cities, they almost don't believe it. And you're talking about whole states. I mean, there's a trailer park on the state border between Kentucky and Tennessee that stretches for about 5 miles. And that is completely ignored. I think that the reason that is that it doesn't benefit anybody. So the race baiters, the race hucksters on the left aren't going to gain anything from recognizing that. I mean, even now today with the post-George Floyd surge, 65% of criminals are just white. They're just poor white guys. I mean, listen to a Haystack CD, or something like that. I mean, it's not, there's nothing you can say about that. It totally destroys the argument that this is somehow all racial. So it's not discussed. At the same time, if you're kind of an alt-leaning right guy, the basic fact that areas that are lawless that are white, Portland also comes to mind, look like any other lawless areas. I mean, that really does a number on these sort of genetic, these sort of moral theories. So there's just not much discussion of poor whites. I would actually define a poor white guy in the sense of being one of the most disadvantaged people in the country as someone who doesn't qualify for affirmative action or legacy programs. Like, if you just think about that, you're going to have a really hard time coming from like Frankfort, Kentucky, Harlan, Kentucky, Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And these are pretty sizable places. And Little Rock, Arkansas, maybe, although that's mixed working class, black and white, but Charleston, West Virginia, and going to, say, Yale. How? What's your path in? Maybe the Army. And a lot of these kids do take advantage of the military and do very well there. But I mean, kind of redirecting here, though, I mean, the poor white crime rate is quite high, but overall, there are more black people in high crime areas. And so the overall black crime rate is 2.4 times the white crime rate on average. And you can't honestly discuss policing without noting that fact. And this is sort of the elephant in the room that's just ignored by 50% maybe of academic research and by almost all media profiles. So you get these ridiculous headlines like 35% of the people shot by police are black, despite black and mixed individuals only making up 15% of the population. Yeah, but we also commit crime at a 2.5% higher rate. So just, I mean, to look at whether that's racist, you just take 15 and you multiply it by 2.5. What you actually get, if you do that, is 37.5. Like, it seems like the police are shooting black people at a slightly lower rate than you would expect. So, I mean, it's just, again, if you are unwilling to discuss the fact that crime rates vary among groups, and that this, not racism, explains differences in arrest rates and so on, the entire police reform conversation becomes nonsensical. I mean, so that's what you're seeing with the bail reform conversation right now, or the equity conversation.
We've all been there before. You want to get someone the perfect gift for the perfect occasion, but you have no idea what to get. Well, you don't have to rack your brain anymore. Gift baskets are perfect for any occasion, whether it's birthdays, holidays, corporate events, or a simple thank you. At designeryourselfgiftbaskets.com, you get to choose the theme and the products that go into the basket. You have a coffee lover? Try the K-Cup basket. You're looking for something special for the person that loves to barbecue? No problem. There's a basket for it. Make every basket unique to the person you're sending it to. And if you're in a rush and don't have time to customize the gift basket, it's not an issue, because at DIYGB.com, you can choose from hundreds of pre-arranged baskets based on the occasion, theme, or recipient. And P.A.S. Report listeners get 10% off using code P.A.S. at checkout. So go to DIYGB.com, find the perfect gift for the perfect occasion, and use coupon code P.A.S. at checkout to get 10% off your order. Visit DIYGB.com today. Take out crime and put in education. You just put out a tweet last week talking about SAT scores and how the Asians perform a lot higher. I think it was 25% you stated over all the other groups. And people were saying, well, it's because of racism, right? Because, the Asian people, I guess they're not minorities anymore, even though statistically they are. So what's the disparity? Why do we see such a higher percentage of Asians doing well on the tests like the SATs, but yet black and white students are not performing well? Hispanic students don't perform as well on these exams.
They study more. I mean, like, it's really like, if it's really
it's that simple.
It is that simple. Like, even if you assume that there's a 5% edge due to either racism or genetics, it doesn't matter what, but between, say, whites and blacks, if you adjust for that 5%, but you assume equivalent study time and you run a model, the gap in terms of the number of high scorers you'd expect is not that large. It's not what you see. And that model doesn't explain Asians at all. I mean, I don't think most people, I certainly haven't seen many HBD quote unquote arguments that there's a massive white East Asian gap in terms of potential IQ. But I mean, just going back into kind of the more conventional theories, like, no one argues Asians face less racism than whites. So, I mean, if you take the two competitors to culture, I don't think they make a ton of sense here. And neither one, I think this is very important, explains the size of the gap that we actually see. So when you look at that, what that gap is, one of the states, I think it was Michigan, recently mandated that everyone in the state take the SAT, all college-ready high school seniors. And so the percentage of them that got over 1,400 was 1% for Native Americans. It was 1% or a little less for blacks. It was 1% for Hispanics, Whites did okay. It was 4%. And then for Asians, it was 25%. Got over a 1,400. Now, that's a good score. I mean, that's about my SAT score. I mean, it's a solid, get you into pretty much any college. 25% of them. And they interviewed some of the kids and they asked, how'd you do it? And they said, well, parental expectations. I know what score you need to get into an Ivy or Big Ten school as an Asian. It was almost sad. But so, I mean, I go home, I hit the books. That's what I did.
And now they get penalized. When we look at the Supreme Court case, what do you think is going to happen with the Harvard Supreme Court case where they're openly discriminating against Asians, saying that basically, well, Asian people are too smart. They study too hard. We can't have them come to this Ivy League institution. We have to sit there and in the name of equity, change standards.
Well, I think that I'm not sure what'll happen in practice. I think it's pretty likely that a Supreme Court where Thomas is playing a really big role that's led 6-3 by conservatives is going to get rid of affirmative action. But we've gotten rid of affirmative action 3 or 4 different times now. I mean, affirmative action used to be just straight up quota programs. And people forget this with all this sort of diversity talk, but the open purpose of affirmative action for a very long time was just admitting more Blacks and Latinos. It wasn't diversity or anything like that. So in the first sort of Bakke cases, and this is going to the late 70s, early 80s, I mean, what you do is just set aside 25% of the class for minorities who were high performing, but not generally on the same plateau as the white kids in the class at that time. There weren't as many Asians then. And so the Supreme Court said you couldn't do that. That's direct racial discrimination. So they set down this standard that you can use vague goals to pursue diversity. And in my favorite finding ever as a businessman, this didn't change the percentage of minorities in college at all. The goal became something like a certain percentage of students interested in studying Black culture or something, if you go school to school, or a certain percentage of students with an HBCU background in graduate schools. These people just came up with these extremely basic proxies, or just lied, or just admitted a certain percentage of Black and Hispanic kids and came up with reasons for it. So we're now in the goals era, the diversity era, and we still see, I mean, Harvard is 16% Black right now. And again, the USA is 12% Black, 15 if you count mixed kids. So it's a really remarkable figure. I mean, like the Black group at Harvard scores about 150 SAT points behind other groups and is overrepresented. So that takes some doing. So I think we might strike down affirmative action, quote unquote, again, but I'm not sure what effect that will have. Like if we just say you can't favor members of any race over any other, my expectation would be that the schools would then move to something like social class. Like they would create some kind of system that would advantage Black and Hispanic people and just call it something else. I think it would be very hard to get this out of the system.
Yeah, it's going to be.
I'm sorry?
It certainly will be, because, I mean, even today we see there's companies, there's school talking about, well, we need to bring in more people. And the way they say they're bringing in more people is essentially dropping standards. I mean, I'm seeing this across the board where you're sacrificing excellence, essentially, just to be politically correct and make your institution or your business look good as if it's diverse. But isn't that a disservice to pretty much every single human being, regardless of color of skin, when you're just dropping these standards, when you're saying to certain students, well, we can't discipline them because we have to understand their backgrounds and where they're coming from. We can't give them bad grades because we have to understand their backgrounds and where they're coming from. If people want to hand in late papers, we have to understand their backgrounds and where they're coming from. Isn't that a disservice to just every human being?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of different levels there. First, yeah, so that gets back to one of the core themes that we've been talking about, which is to what extent can you destroy working systems to pursue these kind of secondary goals or to avoid answering tough questions? Like, to what extent will you let criminals out on the street to simply avoid saying right now, for a variety of reasons, there's a higher Black crime rate? It's the same thing here. I mean, I don't think this helps anyone, by the way. Like, even if you accept that Black or Appalachian students are coming in with a lower starting baseline for doing work, you still have to teach them how to do college level work, or they're going to get out with a useless degree and end up working at Starbucks. But I mean, beyond that, I'm going to say something that's now considered kind of controversial, but there's a more important goal for the college than graduating lots of black people. And that is teaching as many people as possible, as much as possible, so you can keep society functioning and moving forward. So one of the problems you see with this stuff is that you can't just drop standards for black people. I mean, I guess you can. There are a few schools that have basically done that, and it's caused incredible tensions. But what you most often see is just something like the college adopts a relaxed paper submission policy or whatever they call it for everybody. So across this entire campus, you now have a system where kids can turn in work late or not do it at all. And this thing
that's going to serve them well in the real world.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like, a lot of people, there actually are empirical ways to measure this. I mean, the edgy Twitter account, A New Radical Centrism, was actually recently able to get some government IQ data, and it was really fascinating. Like, test scores on things like the military ASVAB by professional level are pretty startling. Like, the average IQ for someone with a master's degree in the USA seems to be about 104 or 105. For someone with a high school degree, it's like 94. College degree is like 98.
Have you looked at our politicians, though? I mean, if we
a lot of them,
tests.
A lot of them seem like, I'd love to see like AOC or Maxine Waters, or for that matter, a couple of Republican guys sit for the test. But no, I mean, that's the thing. Like, IQ is very heavily a result of training. SAT scores certainly are. So if you simply, for politically correct reasons, don't give people any tough, intense education over the years, and you keep passing them forward, and you invent these worthless degrees in fields like the quote unquote studies, what you get after many, many years, and by the way, $100,000 in debt, is someone who's going to test at 102 on the boards and who maybe can't necessarily do all that much. So I think it's a much more important goal of the university system to produce people with 120 scores that are capable of flying planes and arguing court cases than it is to produce perfectly integrated classes of people with 103 scores and, master's degrees in sociology. So you can, that I think is the point. Diversity, unless you are specifically an HR professional or something like that, diversity is never the most important goal of what you do. Like, it's not the most important goal of an airline isn't the color of the pilots. It's whether the planes land safely. So I think we're kind of getting distracted from that. That actually, by the way, was a famous article in Asian Week years ago. I think it was John Yu, the funny Chinese American writer, but actually asked, would you fly on an airline whose motto was, we do everything we can to get more diverse, or would you pick another one? And it's just a good, funny question. I mean, I might pick another one, but
I certainly would. If I'm getting on a plane, I want a pilot that could fly. I don't care where they come from. I don't care what the color of their skin is. I want to take off and land in a safe way and be alive at the end of the trip. That's just my preference. I don't know. Other people may want, the diversity, equity, and inclusion pilots. I don't know. But I really, go ahead.
No, it's an interesting thing. I mean, definitely actually, I honestly kind of lost track of what I was going to say there.
Well,
we keep moving.
It's one of those things where we see this madness, we see the insanity, but people like you are speaking up. And I know you have a book coming out next year, so you're preparing for that. What's the premise of this book going to be about?
Well, this book it's going to be called something like 12 Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You. But it's kind of a riff on obviously there's a famous book called The Lies Your Teacher Told You, which came out in the late 90s and was kind of a useful expose at that time of maybe the sort of jingoistic education system we used to have in the USA. So they're talking about things like the claim that there weren't very many Indians, Native Americans in the USA when whites and blacks got here. Just pointing out some of the mistakes made throughout American history, but poking holes in some of those sacred cow narratives. But one of the things that I realized years ago reading through high school textbooks, because I co-teach at a local high school, was that era is dead. I mean, the idea that your teachers are these rock-ribbed Midwestern conservatives that won't stop praising God. I mean, that even in Kentucky, that's not generally the case. So I started looking at kind of some of the things going from the other direction. And so I wrote a book kind of criticizing modern education and countering some of the things you hear now. Like, one of the chapters is looking at the Red Scare, quote unquote. And I point out that in political science, we know they declassified the Venona cables in 1995. And all those people that were accused of being communist spies were communist spies. I mean, we have a list of about 485 of these guys that were spying for the Russians. And that's something that for whatever, capital letters, for whatever reason, is just never mentioned. So I talk about that at chapter length. Another one of the chapters is just called Native Americans Weren't Peaceful. And I describe some of the new research.
You mean to tell me that they weren't all sitting around with the tribe singing Kumbaya along with each other?
Well, no, I mean, but if you look at, I printed out some of the U.S. government lessons on native life from the Department of Agriculture, this kind of thing. And it really is literally the natives lived in perfect harmony with the world. Never was a fish wasted. Never was an animal killed in vain. So on down the line. And I actually read some of the best academic research on Native Americans, and that's not quite the case. So, I mean, I talk about, some of the hunting methods, like driving whole herds of buffalo off cliffs. But I mean, more to the point, I discuss just the great native cultures in, North and Mesoamerica and what they did. And I admire a lot of these people, but like the Aztec, the Comanche, they were some of the greatest warriors in history. So I talk about their wars among one another and with the whites. And it's a dramatically different picture, and actually kind of a cooler picture of your young boy, but then the one you're getting from your textbook right now. So why are we presenting, our country's opponents for 400 years as these sort of hapless herbivores? It ties into modern politics more than it does into reality. So that's another chapter. I talk about slavery, which in every textbook I've read is presented as kind of a unique white, if not just American vice, and kind of do the Thomas Sowell riff where I add a couple things that I don't even think he does, but just talking about this historically, the Barbary slave trade, native slave trade. I mean, the slave trade going on now is another thing. No. So, I mean, you can go to specific darknet links today and buy a slave. So what, and I don't include them in the book, but so why has slavery become so associated with this particular group of whites in this particular time? I talk about that. And the obvious reason, again, is contemporary left versus right American politics. But that's coming out with a major publisher, and that should be out. I'm a little behind turning it in. Actually, let's do August. I have 5 pages to go. But that I'm looking forward to getting it in. And that should actually be an actual bestseller.
No,
Hoax
when it does come out, definitely want you back on when it does come out. We'll put it all over the place because people have to read your work. It is fascinating. And you do it in a humorous way where you actually draw. It's not some dry, boring, you get tired after the first chapter. Your books are actually interesting. That's why I love them so much. And that's why I'm looking forward to the next one. So I really appreciate you coming on. We're going to have links up at the P.A.S. report. And thank you so much for coming on, Wilfred.
All right. Thanks for having me on, man.
Great conversation, and I thank Wilfred for coming on. Don't forget to check out his books, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Be sure to follow him on Twitter. His Twitter feed's great. It's funny, it's informative. Trust me, it will not disappoint you. So check it out. I have all the links up at the P.A.S. Report website, PASreport.com. Share this episode with family and friends and on social media. I'm working on a great episode for Wednesday. You are not going to want to miss it. It's extremely important. Until then, I want to thank you for joining me.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.